Welcome, everybody. My name is LevDev, and welcome to Top Deck Thoughts. Now, for this episode, this is actually going to be an episode to help cover the upcoming expansion that is actually coming out. As of this video, it will be coming out within the week this video came out, as well as I'll be doing the early access event for this set on Tuesday, which is Alchemy Horizons Baldur's Gate. For those who don't know, this is actually a new exclusive arena set that's going to be coming out on Thursday, this upcoming Thursday. The basic Catch-22 premise of the set is essentially, they took the original Commander Legends 2 Baldur's Gate set, and essentially took some of the cards as well as redesigned some of the cards to essentially port onto the digital arena client for specifically the Alchemy Historic as well as just friendly challenge formats, essentially, or even like stuff like cube and such, or event-based events when they want to play with the cards and such. Nevertheless, it's actually a pretty big set. They pretty much put the full stops on this. This is actually a draftable set, as well as the potential that there's going to be a full mastery pass for it and all that stuff. So we're definitely going to be playing this a little bit until essentially in September, when essentially we get back to standard with Dominaria United. But for some people, this is actually going to be their first time getting into the Alchemy format, and the Alchemy format does have a lot of digital variation mechanics that for people who are new to the game might actually be a little bit confused, or for those who it's the first time coming into Alchemy. I thought this video would be kind of nice to actually explain both the mechanics that are coming into this new set with the Baldur's Gate set, essentially, as well as to explain to people essentially the mechanics that are within the set, because nevertheless, the Baldur Gate's mechanics are technically kind of like variations, with the exception of one mechanic card we'll get to. Essentially variations of the alchemy mechanics that were within previous sets. So, cue the joke here how everything is a variation of Kicker. With Baldur's Gate, about almost all the new mechanics that are coming from it are a variation of alchemy-based digital mechanics. Nevertheless, I'm actually going to get to the website that shows the card gallery and just explain the mechanics, as well as essentially actually have a few little videos showing the mechanics in action. So, nevertheless, let's get started, shall we? Anyway, let's get started in learning some alchemy-based mechanics. Now, I'm looking at the card image gallery here. It does have some returning mechanics from previous alchemy sets, but it also has new mechanics. And as stated before, they are technically variations, but I thought it would be best to start off with essentially this removal spell, Sea Tower Imprisonment, because it shows one of the pretty much original alchemy mechanics, which in this case is, when it enters the battlefield, conjure a card named Soldier of the Watch onto the battlefield. Now, for those who don't know, conjure is an alchemy-based mechanic, which basically means, like, for those who ever played with Garth One-Eye, you kind of get a hint of what this is. But the basic Catch-22 is you actually create a card out of the blue, or create technically a token of the card, even though it's technically not a token, so it can't be modified by tokens. But essentially, you create a card that you will put into your hand, unless stated otherwise. Like, for example, there's sometimes, like, for example, with Sea Tower Imprisonment, where you conjure the card and then you automatically put it onto the battlefield. But there's a majority of conjure cards that also put the conjured card within your hand. So, it can vary. There's even some where you actually conjure the card within your deck as well. Nevertheless, that is the explanation of the conjure mechanic, and the reason why I wanted to start with that is to actually explain one of the new mechanics that are coming into the set, and we're going to use Champions of Tyr to explain it, which is the Double Team mechanic. Now, this is a variation of the Myriad mechanic, modified for a 1v1 format. For those who don't know how Double Team works, the basic premise is when you attack with a Double Team creature for the first time, you will conjure a card that is a copy of the card that's attacking with Double Team. And then once you create that or quote-unquote conjure that copy into your hand, both of them will lose the Double Team. So obviously Double Team is here as a way to generate card advantage and such, and maybe help with more aggressive deck designs and such. Or even there's some potential combo shenanigans, like one card I'm looking right off the bat that would be kind of funny is like Sworn to the Legion, which pretty much makes it where all your creatures that enter the battlefield, as well as creatures that you can essentially cast, will gain the Double Team ability, so being able to get like double Goldspan dragons and such can lead to some pretty silly shenanigans. So keep this an eye out. Nevertheless, we're also now going to get to the newish mechanic, even though technically it's not, but it is now a mechanic that does have a keyword. And the keyword here is the boon mechanic. So we're going to use Valiant Farewell as our example here. Target creature control gets +2 attack until end of turn. When this creature leaves the battlefield this turn, you get a boon that says when you cast your next creature spell, it perpetually gets +2/+0, draw a card. We're going to explain about what perpetual means in a quick minute, but first of all, let's talk about how boons work. Boons are kind of like emblems, temporary emblems that you will get once you essentially cast a spell or do an ETB trigger that gives a boon. And basically what the boon does is whatever the next spell you're going to cast, it will give an effect. Like the more popular example is the cute little pup that we got from last year's Alchemy set. That's a very popular card where essentially when it enters the battlefield, the next creature spell you cast enters with a +1 Vigilance and Trample counter. So it's kind of like that, but this one is different because it allows us to essentially get the buff perpetually. So what does perpetually mean? Well, perpetually is also another alchemy-based mechanic. The basic catch-22 premise of what perpetual means is that it essentially will either modify the text of a card or modify its stats to even its mana cost potentially, so that essentially, and those stats are kind of like permanent on the quote-unquote card. So for example, if it goes to any zone, whether in your hand, in your deck, in exile, like if in Commander for example, or even like Foretell or essentially adventure spells and such, the card will still keep its perpetual traits. So for example here, making one of your creatures have the perpetual ability of pretty much getting +2 attack can be pretty good, especially if you want to return it and all that stuff and still have kind of like a powerful card. So that is how boon and also perpetual works, which actually was kind of nice that we got to that. Nevertheless, let's also go to another mechanic that's in the set. We talked about boon. We even talked a little bit about perpetual. One other example of perpetual, sometimes it will change text of the card, like for example this one. Essentially, target opponent reveals all creature and cards in their hand. Choose one of them, and then you give your opponent's card essentially a perpetually text that says the permanent enters the battlefield tap. So you will see in the set, as well as in previous alchemy sets, that there are some essentially perpetual cards that both give positive effects to you, as well as potential negative effects to your opponent's cards, essentially. So keep that in mind. And then there's even cards like essentially Patriarchal Humiliation, where it can even essentially remove all, essentially, well, technically it's still perpetual, but it will lose all of its abilities, so it's something to keep in mind. Another mechanic that is in the set, let's take a look. We also are having a Return of Adventure, which is nice, but we are sticking for alchemy-based mechanics, just essentially alchemy mechanics. Anyway, another mechanic that is an alchemy-based mechanic that's in this set is the mechanic called Seek. Now, how Seek works is essentially, it basically amounts to the following. What it does is it's kind of like a variation of draw, where it's essentially you draw a random card in your deck based on the seeking requirements. So for example, for signature spells as our example here, when it's enters the battlefield, we seek 2 instant or sorcery cards with mana value 3. So basically here, the catch-22 is you essentially sometimes seeks will have specific requirements of what card you're going to be seeking with it. Whether it could be a non-land or land, essentially, there's a variety of seek cards that essentially seek specific cards in your deck. A few interesting things to note, though. 1. When you do seek with cards that have seek on them, it doesn't actually change the order of your library, or it doesn't shuffle it. So if you are playing a deck design where your top deck card matters, you can actually play seek cards to help draw cards without potentially manipulating the top part of your deck, if you don't want it manipulated, so that's something to keep in mind. Also, just keep in mind that with Seek in general, due to the fact of how Seek essentially is worded, you could modify your deck designs to essentially be very specific and tutor specific cards. Like, for example, for this one, you could tutor, like, let's say, a draw spell or Teferi's Protection and just have some silly shenanigans. So, something to keep in mind there. Okay. And then one of the other mechanics that are in Alchemy that will be in the set is what we call specifically, the draft from a spellbook mechanic, or draft mechanic. Now, for example, one of the legendary creatures that have this mechanic is Oya Minartok Polar Whalebear. Now, it has a activated ability to sacrifice a food token, and it says here, draft a card from, I'm not going to repeat that name again, spellbook. When you do, add 3 blue. Spend this mana only to cast blue creature spells. Now, what they mean when you draft from a spellbook, in the Alchemy in general, you will have cards that essentially allow you to draft from a spellbook. The basic premise is it's a list of 15 cards, usually within this specific spellbook's theme. For example, for this one, it's essentially a bunch of blue, essentially fish creatures, sea creatures, essentially, because the premise is a giant werebear fishing, kind of like that theme, essentially. And what happens is you essentially will get 3 random cards from that spell book, and you essentially choose one of those 3 random cards to put into your hand. There are some times where variation of the draft mechanic can also put it onto the battlefield as well, so keep that in mind. But yeah, the basic premise of drafting from a spellbook is you essentially get 3 cards from essentially a list of cards in a specific spellbook's theme to essentially choose from one of the 3 to put into your hand. For those who played Hearthstone and played Discover-based cards, it's kind of like a variation of that. Kind of works similar mechanic-wise, so to speak. Also, we are now going to talk about one of the, dare we say, controversial new mechanics that came in the set, which is, well, I can't really procrastinate on it, can I? So, there is also gates, and one thing to note is the gates are technically modified to essentially be different from the gates within the set, just so it allows you to seek an online card and such. Okay, let's talk about the specialized mechanic. Now, for those who don't know, in this upcoming set, the new kind of like feature mechanic that's coming into the set is the specialized mechanic. And as it says here, you can pick cited cards. Well, you can pretty much post your response here appearing the fact that there's a cited card. Now, let Magic the Gathering so your response here. No.
It's not 6 sides. It's not 6 sides.
Nevertheless, the basic premise of the specialized mechanic, though, is what you're doing is you essentially get a front side card, which in this case is Clement Novice Acolyte. We're going to use as an example here. A 2/2, and it has specialized 2. So basically, the catch-22 premise is once you activate the specialized mechanic, you essentially spend the mana as well as discard a card. Now, depending on which card you discard, as it says here, you discard a card, color, or land type of your choice to change your card to a new card with its effects. The change depends on which color you discarded. So, like for example, if you discard, say, a Plains, you essentially will change it into Clement Life Acolyte, which essentially can have modified stats as well as modified new abilities and such. Like then, for example, you could also say discard an island and get this variation of Clement. It's essentially a variation of transform as well as you could argue kind of like it's like a perpetual transform mechanic essentially, because what it does basically once you specialize a card, it will permanently change to this for the rest of the game. And essentially, like when it's in the graveyard, it will be this variation rather than going back to the front side. So, something to keep in mind when you're doing the specialized mechanic. Now, for example, with Clement, this is actually really easy to show because, well, we see all new arts that essentially have special abilities and such, and kind of essentially show the essentially him specializing into different roles. Now, the problem was, and this is where we're going to get into the slight little opinion aspect of this informational. This mechanic was a little controversial since it was originally introduced with pretty much the way that they did it is with the specialized mechanic. It's the way that they actually modified the original Commander, pretty much Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate background commanders. These are all new cards with different stats as well as essentially different abilities and such. And then they all have essentially a specialized mechanic, and to distinguish themselves, they basically change the coloring and such. Which, I mean, I'll take your opinion on that, on whether or not you like the fact that they approached it like this or not. It's not going to be a full-on opinion piece here, that's another episode, but nevertheless, one thing I would recommend when playing with the specialized mechanic is to at least keep in mind of these other cards, but when you're brewing on Arena and such, when you get into Constructed, I basically look at it this way. You look at these and figure out which one you are mostly wanting to specialize into. Like, for example, we go back to Clement here. It's a Tiefling Cleric, and it essentially gives all of our creature cards in our hand a +1/+1 perpetual benefit. So, this is just a 2-drop Cleric. I am probably going to put this in the Cleric, kind of like Tribal deck. And then I have to ask myself if I want to specialize in something different. Now, mostly in Clerics, the popular Orzhov archetype is Orzhov Clerics. So I have to ask myself, okay, Clement is beneficial on the front side. Do I want to have the specialized ability to have it where it creates 2 black zombie creature tokens? Depending on your variation of design, you might actually like that, because maybe you have like sacrificial outlets and such, and getting the tokens to sacrifice and such. Very nice. Or maybe you want to play Orzhov Clerics and then allow you to be able to get this semi-card draw and such. So there's a variety of ways you can do the deck design. Though one thing to keep in mind when drafting the set with all the background commanders, which are transformed into specialized commanders, basically my best advice when playing these cards is just read the front side and just keep in mind that the back side is going to mostly either be a beneficial generation of resources or just essentially just upgraded value on the card. The one that I like to point out, for example, is Vault Eco Scholar. This one essentially allows you, it's essentially a free mana looter in the set, with a specialized of 5 mana, but that's important because every time you loot, you put a study counter on it, and for example, if we specialize into Vault Scholar of Mortality, when this creature specialized, we remove all those study counters from it. When you do, put target creature card with mana value less than or equal to the number of study counters removed this way from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. So, a lot of value. You could consider, since we do like looters and reanimator based deck designs, you could make like a Dimir reanimator deck and throw Vault in here to essentially be able to loot and actually just be inevitably turned into a 5 mana reanimation spell. This is definitely a very information heavy based mechanic. It is I could even see some people arguing that this is a very convoluted mechanic, but it does actually have some cleverness to this, and the one opinion I will say of this mechanic is, as information heavy front as it is, I do kind of like this mechanic, mostly because it's kind of like a cute ploy on kind of like how we have essentially in video game RPGs, where basically you have your base character, and then essentially with your base character, they essentially have it in modern designs like you see in the Baldur Gate series. Ironically enough, we're talking about Baldur Gates here, where you can essentially have specialized kind of like classes for a specific. When you choose your base class, you can also specialize into different ones, mostly to help you out with your design. Like if you decide to be the cleric and you don't need your second cleric in your party, you can specialize them into being like a death cleric or something like that, essentially. Specialize them and get them additional abilities to essentially help you on your quest within playing the games. And I kind of like this mechanic, as convoluted as it is. I do like how it is a ploy and kind of like an homage to that kind of like cool thing about video game based RPG designs. That's my perspective, though. Still, nevertheless, I didn't mean this to be an opinion piece. Nevertheless, with Specialized, I would say the best way to play with these cards, in my opinion, Just play as the front side, and then if you ever splash into a second color, then keep in mind accommodating your deck design with the second color and such, and maybe benefit you better with the drafting archetype. I will say it'll be very interesting to see how people draft these cards. Nevertheless, that is all the upcoming mechanics that are coming in the new Baldur's Gate set. I'm definitely going to have some fun jank brewing with this, especially on the early access stream this Tuesday. I'll be doing that. I'll be doing that throughout the day. Just trying out some janky brews, even trying draft format. I'm really curious about the draft format here. Nevertheless, I hope you all have a lovely day. As they say, hip hip hooray.